The stars above Colony Vela 7 had always been peaceful. But on this morning, they brought death from the darkness between worlds. Commander Gelver stood on the bridge of his warship and looked down at the small human settlement with cold satisfaction in his 4 narrow eyes. He had done this 17 times before across 17 different star systems. And every single time the result had been the same. Complete and total victory without any real resistance. The Kovati Empire had ruled the outer spiral arm for 3,000 years. And their power came from one simple truth that every conquered species learned too late. They controlled the Varkan. Say's creatures were not simply animals or beasts in the way that lesser species understood such things. They were living weapons, massive predators that stood 12 feet tall on 6 powerful limbs, with hides thick enough to stop energy blasts and claws sharp enough to tear through metal doors like paper for 10,000 years. The Korvathi had bred them for one purpose and one purpose only: to kill without mercy, without hesitation, and without ever stopping until their masters called them back. No army had ever stood against them. No fortress had ever held them out, and no species had ever found a way to fight them. The Varkan were fear itself given flesh and bone. And Commander Gelver had 3 of the finest specimens ever bred waiting in the deployment bay below. He turned to his second officer, a younger Kovathi named Vethkai, and gestured toward the viewscreen that showed the human colony spread across the rust-colored plains below. "What do we know about these creatures?" Gelver asked, his voice carrying the bored tone of someone who did not expect the answer to matter. Vethkai consulted the data tablet in his clawed hands and read aloud. "They call themselves humans, Commander. They originated from a small world called Earth in a minor system near the galactic edge. This colony contains approximately 4,000 individuals, mostly agricultural workers and their families. They have no military presence, no defensive weapons beyond basic security measures, and no warships." Gelver made a sound that might have been laughter if the Kovati had possessed such a concept. "Farmers," he said, with contempt dripping from every syllable. "They send farmers to colonize new worlds, while greater species tremble at our approach. These humans are either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps both. Commander." Vethkai offered. Below them on the planet's surface, the humans of Vela 7 were just beginning their day. The twin suns were rising over the eastern mountains and casting long shadows across the biodomes and greenhouses that dotted the settlement. Children were waking up and eating breakfast while their parents prepared for another day of work in the hydroponic fields and protein farms. They had received no warning of what was coming because the Kovathi did not believe in warnings. Fear was useful, but surprise was even more effective in the northern section of the colony. A woman named Adaze Okonkwo was walking her daughter, Mira, to the community learning center when the first explosion shook the ground beneath their feet. Adaze grabbed Mira and pulled her close as sirens began to scream across the settlement. She looked up and saw the massive Kovathi warship descending through the clouds like a falling mountain, and her heart filled with a terror she had never known before. "Mama, what is happening?" Mira asked, her voice small and frightened. "I do not know, baby," Adaze whispered back. "But we need to run right now." All across the colony, humans were doing the same thing, grabbing their children, calling for their loved ones, and running for any shelter they could find. They had no weapons that could fight a warship, no soldiers trained for combat, and no idea what was coming for them. Commander Gelver watched the panic on his screens and felt nothing but mild impatience. This was taking too long already, and he had other systems to conquer before the cycle ended. "Release the Varkan," he ordered. In the deployment bay, 3 massive holding cells opened with a hiss of pressure release. Inside each one, a nightmare stirred and rose to its feet. The largest of them was called Ketharek in the old Kovathi tongue, which meant the one who ends all things in the human language. He was ancient by Varkan standards, nearly 200 years old, and his hide was covered with scars from 100 different battles on 100 different worlds. Skethrak had killed more living beings than most Korvati could count. He had torn through armies, shattered defensive walls, and hunted survivors through the ruins of cities that had once held millions. There was no mercy in him, no hesitation, and no memory of anything except blood and death and the cold satisfaction of the kill. The three Varkan dropped from the ship like falling stars, their massive bodies crashing into the colony grounds with enough force to shake buildings and crack pavement within seconds. The screaming Bagunzel Vor watched with approval as the two younger Varkan tore through the northern residential area, their claws and teeth making quick work of any human too slow to escape. This was exactly how it always went, exactly how it was supposed to go. And he was already thinking about his report to the High Command when he noticed something strange. Gakithrak was not killing. The old beast had landed near the eastern section of the colony, close to a cluster of greenhouses where food was grown, and his neural tracker showed that he had stopped moving almost immediately after landing. Silver frowned and adjusted the sensors to get a better reading. The Varkan was alive, his vital signs were strong and normal, but he was simply standing still, which was something a Varkan never did during a hunt. What is wrong with Ketharak? He demanded. Vikay checked the data and shook his head in confusion. I do not know, Commander. All his systems are functioning normally, but he is not responding to movement stimuli. It is as if he has simply decided to stop. A Varkan does not decide anything. Jelver snapped. They are weapons. They do what we bred them to do. But even as he said the words, he felt a strange unease growing in his chest. Something was wrong here. Something that did not fit the pattern he had seen repeated across 17 conquered star systems. He dispatched a surveillance drone to investigate, watching its feed on his personal screen as it flew over the burning colony toward the eastern greenhouses. What the drone found when it arrived would change everything Commander Jelver believed about humans, about Varkan, and about the nature of power itself. But he did not know that yet. All he knew in that moment was that his greatest weapon had stopped working, and he could not understand why. Myra Okonkwo was 11 years old, and she had always been a quiet child who noticed things that others missed. She noticed when her mother was sad, even when she smiled. She noticed when the plants in the greenhouse needed water before they started to wilt. And she noticed the way animals in the colony would come to her, even when they ran from everyone else. Her grandmother had called it a gift before she passed away 2 years ago. She had held Myra's small hands in her wrinkled ones and told her that some people were born with hearts big enough to feel what others were feeling, and that this was the most precious thing a person could have. Myra thought about her grandmother often, especially when she was scared right now. She was more scared than she had ever been in her entire life when the explosion started and the sirens began to scream. Her mother had grabbed her hand and they had run together through the chaos of the colony. People were crying and shouting and pushing past each other. And Mira had seen things that she knew would give her nightmares. For years to come, if she lived that long, her mother had pulled her into the eastern greenhouse, the big one, where they grew tomatoes and peppers and the special flowers that reminded Mama of home, and had shoved her toward the small door that led down to the underground root cellar. Stay here, Mama had said, her voice shaking but her eyes fierce and determined. Stay here and do not come out until I come back for you. Do you understand me, Mira? Mama, please do not leave me. I have to find your father. I have to make sure he is safe. You stay here, and you hide, and you do not make a sound. No matter what you hear, promise me. I promise, Myra had whispered, and then her mother was gone. And she was alone in the darkness of the root cellar with nothing but the distant sounds of Destruction and death. She did not know how long she stayed there in the dark. It felt like hours, but it might have been only minutes. She pressed her hands over her ears and hummed the songs her grandmother used to sing, old songs from Earth, from a country called Nigeria that Mira had never seen, but that lived in her blood and her bones through the stories her family told. And then the ceiling exploded. Mira screamed as dirt, metal, and pieces of greenhouse glass rained down around her. She threw her arms over her head and curled into a ball, waiting for the pain that she was sure would come when she finally looked up. She saw the monster. It was the biggest living thing she had ever seen, bigger than the cargo trucks that brought supplies from the landing field, bigger than the community hall where everyone gathered for celebrations. It stood on 6 legs that ended in claws longer than her entire arm, and its body was covered in thick gray hide marked with countless scars. Its head swung toward her, and she saw 6 eyes as black as the space between stars, and a mouth that opened to reveal rows and rows of teeth that looked like they could bite through steel. The creature roared, and the sound was so loud and so terrible that Mira felt it in her chest like a physical blow. The force of it knocked her backward against the wall of the root cellar, and she tasted blood where she had bitten her tongue. This was death, she knew. This was the end of everything, and she was going to die alone in the dark while her mother searched for her father. Somewhere in the burning colony, the monster took a step toward her, its massive claws digging into the dirt floor, and Mira knew she should run. Every part of her body was screaming at her to run, to flee, to try to escape, even though there was nowhere to go. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the shock of the moment. Maybe it was the strange calm that sometimes comes when fear becomes too big to hold. Or maybe it was that gift her grandmother had talked about, that ability to feel what others were feeling, because as Mira looked into those 6 black eyes, she saw something that nobody else in the galaxy had ever seen when they looked at a Varkin. Saw pain, not physical pain from wounds or injuries, but something deeper and older, a pain that had been buried so far down that even the creature itself had forgotten it was there. She saw loneliness that stretched back centuries. She saw a rage that had been fed and stoked until it burned away everything else. And she saw a tiny spark of something that might once have been the ability to feel something other than the need to kill. The monster roared again, and Myra felt tears streaming down her face, but they were not tears of fear anymore. "It is okay," she whispered, and her voice was so small that it should have been lost in the echoes of that terrible roar. But somehow the creature heard its head tilted to the side, just slightly, and for a moment its advance stopped. "It is okay," Myra said again, louder this time, forcing the words past the terror that was trying to close her throat. "You do not have to be angry anymore. I know you are hurting. I can feel it. You have been hurting for such a long time, and nobody ever helped you. And that is not fair." The Varkin made a sound that was not a roar. It was something lower and stranger, almost like a question. Mara took a shaking step forward, even though every instinct she had was telling her to run away. She held out her small hand toward the monster, palm up, the same way she would offer her hand to a scared dog or a wounded bird. "My name is Mira," she said, "and I am scared too. But we do not have to be scared alone. That is what my grandmother always told me. She said that everything in the universe just wants to be understood, and everything that hurts that much just wants someone to be kind." The Varkin stood frozen, its 6 eyes fixed on this tiny human child who was not running, who was not screaming, who was looking at it like it was something more than a weapon, something stirred deep inside the creature, something that the Kovathi had spent 10,000 years trying to destroy through breeding and training and conditioning. It was the memory of a time before it was a weapon, before it was a killer, when its species had lived in family groups and cared for their young and felt something like love slowly. So slowly that Mira barely noticed at first. the massive creature lowered itself to the ground. Its 6 legs folded beneath its body, and its scarred head came down until it was resting on the dirt floor of the ruined greenhouse. It exhaled, and the sound was like a storm finally passing. Myra walked forward on trembling legs and sat down beside the monster. She placed her small hand on its neck, feeling the rough texture of its scarred hide and the slow, powerful rhythm of its heartbeat. "It is okay," she whispered one more time. "You are not alone anymore." Above them, the surveillance drone hovered and recorded everything. On the bridge of the Kovathi warship, Commander Jalver watched in stunned silence as his greatest weapon closed its eyes and slept peacefully beside a human child. He had no words for what he was seeing, because in 3,000 years of Kovathi history, nothing like this had ever happened. And in his chest, something cold and unfamiliar began to grow. It was fear, real fear, for the first time in his entire life. For 3 days, Commander Jalver tried everything he could think of to reclaim his weapon. He sent signals through the neural control implant that had been placed in Catharak's brain at birth. The implant that should have forced absolute obedience no matter what. The old Varkin did not respond, did not even twitch, did not show any sign that he had received the command at all. He tried the pain function, which sent electrical pulses directly into the creature's nervous system, and had never failed to force compliance in 10,000 years of Kovathi weapons research. Catharak's body jerked once when the pulse hit him, but instead of rising to attack, he simply curled tighter around the human child. Shielding her with his massive body, he tried starvation, refusing to send food or water, hoping that hunger would eventually override whatever strange malfunction had taken hold. But the Varkin simply lay there, calm and still, and the girl shared her own small supplies with the creature, as if it were a pet rather than a monster that had killed millions finally. On the 3rd day, Jalver lost his patience and sent soldiers. 12 of his best warriors descended to the surface in combat armor, carrying weapons that could punch through starship hulls. Their orders were simple: kill the child and retrieve the Varkin. Using whatever force was necessary, they approached the ruined greenhouse in standard formation, their weapons raised and ready. The old Varkin appeared to be sleeping, his massive body wrapped around the human girl, like a wall of scarred flesh and bone. The squad leader raised his hand to give the signal to fire, and then Catharak opened his eyes. What happened next was over in less than 30 seconds. The surveillance drones captured every moment of it, and the footage would later be studied by Kovathi military scholars for generations. The Varkin moved faster than anything that size should have been able to move. He rose from the ground like a mountain coming to life, and he placed himself directly between the soldiers and the child. He did not attack immediately. He simply stood there, a wall of muscle and fury, and he made a sound that none of the Kovathi had ever heard a Varkin make before. It was low and rumbling and full of warning. The sound of a creature that was saying very clearly, "Do not come any closer." The squad leader, a veteran of many campaigns who had seen Varkin in action hundreds of times, felt something he had never felt before and battled out. "Fire!" He shouted, because his training told him that hesitation meant death. The soldiers opened fire, their weapons blazing with energy that could melt steel. Catharak took the hits across his scarred hide and barely seemed to notice. Then he charged. 4 soldiers died in the first 3 seconds, their armor torn apart like paper. The others tried to retreat, tried to regroup, tried to bring their heavier weapons to bear. But Catharak was everywhere at once, moving with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for a creature bred only for mindless violence. When it was over, 8 soldiers lay dead in the dirt, and the remaining 4 were running for their shuttle as fast as their legs could carry them. Catharak watched them go, making no move to chase them, And then he turned and walked back to where Myra was standing. The girl had not run. She had not screamed. She had simply watched with wide eyes as the monster that had chosen to protect her proved just how deadly he could be. "Thank you," she whispered. And she wrapped her small arms around one of his massive legs. Arak made that low rumbling sound again. But this time, it was softer, almost gentle on the bridge of the warship. Commander Gelver stared at the footage in silence for a long time. Then he summoned his ship's xenobiologist, a scholar named Tethany, who had spent her entire life studying the creatures that the Kravathi conquered. "Explain this to me," he demanded. "Explain how a human child has done what no species in the history of the galaxy has ever done. Turned one of our weapons against us." Tethany had already been studying the footage for hours. She had analyzed the human's biological readings, studied the Varkan's neural patterns, and consulted every database of alien psychology that the Kravathi possessed. What she had found terrified her in ways she could not quite explain. "The humans have a concept," she began slowly, choosing her words with care. "They call it by several different names: bonding, love, compassion, empathy. We do not have direct translations for any of these words because we have never needed them. What do these words mean?" Gelver Askedithani was quiet for a moment, trying to find a way to explain something that was completely outside the Kravathi understanding of the universe. "It is a form of emotional connection," she said finally, "but not based on dominance or submission or usefulness. Humans form attachments to other creatures, to each other, to animals, even to objects based on something they call caring. They choose to feel responsible for the well-being of others, even when there is no practical benefit to themselves." Gelver made a sound of disgust. "That is weakness. That is foolishness. Why would any creature choose to burden itself with such useless emotions?" "I thought the same thing," Tethany admitted. "But Commander, look at the results. That child did not fight the Varkan. She did not try to control him with pain or commands or force. She simply sat with him and spoke to him and showed him kindness, and in response, he chose to protect her." She pulled up the neural readings from Ketharak's implant and displayed them on the main screen. "Look at this. The Varkan's brain activity has changed completely. Parts of his neural structure that have been dormant since birth are suddenly active. It is as if the child awakened something inside him that we spent 10,000 years trying to destroy." Gelver stared at the readings, and the cold fear in his chest grew stronger. "What did we destroy?" he asked quietly. Tilani looked at him with something that might have been pity if Kravathi understood such emotions. "I believe we destroyed their ability to bond, their capacity for something like love. We bred it out of them because we wanted pure weapons, pure killers, but the capacity was never completely gone. It was just buried, waiting for something to bring it back. And this human child brought it back with nothing but words and a gentle touch." "Yes, Commander. That is exactly what happened." Gelver turned back to the view screen, where the surveillance drones still showed Ketharak curled protectively around the human girl. "What are these creatures?" he whispered, and for the first time in his long career of conquest, he was asking a question he genuinely did not know the answer to. Tethany shook her head slowly. "I do not know, Commander. But I think we may have made a serious mistake by coming to their world. Below them, in the ruins of the greenhouse, Miro Konkol looked up at the stars and wondered if her mother was still alive. Beside her, the monster that the galaxy feared more than death itself rumbled softly and pressed his scarred head against her side. She placed her hand on his rough hide and felt his heartbeat. Slow and strong and steady. "We are going to be okay," she told him. "I do not know how, but I know we will be. And somehow." In a way that made no logical sense at all, Catharak believed her. The footage spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. started with a leak someone on Commander Jelver's ship. Perhaps a crew member who was tired of endless conquest. Or perhaps a scholar who wanted the universe to see what she had discovered. Whoever it was, they transmitted the surveillance recordings to an underground network that the Kovathi had never been able to completely destroy within hours. Billions of beings across 100 conquered worlds had seen the impossible. A human child sitting beside a sleeping Varkan, her small hand resting on the monster's scarred neck. Both of them peaceful and unafraid. The effect was immediate and profound on the mining world of Kathos III. A Veldrani slave named Rishal watched the footage on a hidden screen in the tunnels where he had worked since childhood. He had seen Varkan tear through his people when the Kovathi first conquered his world. Had watched his father die beneath those terrible claws. Had spent 20 years believing that resistance was impossible. But now, looking at that little human girl, he felt something he had not felt in decades. Hopian, the factory moon of Thyris. A Kulani worker named Shivith showed the footage to her fellow slaves during their brief rest period. They gathered around the tiny screen, dozens of them crammed into a space meant for 10. And they watched in stunned silence as the galaxy's most feared weapon chose to protect instead of destroy. How did she do it? Someone whispered. She was kind to it, Shivith answered. She simply showed it kindness. And it chose to be kind in return. The idea was revolutionary, not because it was complicated, but because it was so simple that no one had ever thought to try it across the Korvathi Empire. Enslaved species began to experiment. They had no weapons, no ships, no way to fight back through force, but perhaps they did not need force at all on Vela 7. The humans who had survived the initial attack began to emerge from their hiding places. They had watched the footage too, had seen what young Myra had accomplished with nothing but courage and compassion. And they decided to try the same thing. The two younger Varkan were still roaming the colony. Still dangerous, still programmed to kill anything that moved. Approaching them seemed like suicide, but a man named David Chun, who had spent 30 years as a veterinarian caring for animals of all kinds, decided to take the risk. He walked into the open with no weapons, no armor, nothing but a bag of food and a calm voice. The Varkan he approached was called Tethav, younger than Ketharak, but still deadly enough to have killed dozens of colonists in the initial attack when Tethaver saw him. The creature roared and charged. David did not run. He dropped to his knees, lowered his head, and held out the food in his trembling hands. He spoke softly, the same way he had spoken to frightened dogs and injured horses and scared cats throughout his career. Easy, he said. Easy now. I am not here to hurt you. I just want to help. Tever stopped 3 feet away, close enough that David could smell the blood on the creature's breath. The Varkan's claws were raised, ready to strike. And David was certain that he was about to die, but he kept talking, kept his voice calm and gentle, kept offering the food. Something shifted in the Varkan's black eyes. The claws lowered slowly, and the creature made a sound that was almost curious. David felt tears streaming down his face as Toffer leaned forward and took the food from his hands with surprising gentleness. Within a week, both of the younger Varkan had been bonded to human caretakers. They followed their new companions everywhere, protective and alert. No longer the mindless killing machines the Korvathi had created, but something new, something with choice words spread to the other conquered worlds. And the uprisings began. They were not violent uprisings. The enslaved species had learned over generations that violence against the Korvathi only brought more pain and death. Instead, they were uprisings of kindness. On Kathos III, Rishal and his fellow miners began leaving food for the Varkan that guarded the mine entrances. At first, the creatures ignored the offerings, but over time, they began to eat. And over more time, they began to wait for Rishal specifically, recognizing him as the one who fed them on Thyris. Shiveth organized her fellow workers to care for the wounded Varkin that returned from battles across the Empire. They treated injuries, removed painful embedded shrapnel, and spoke gently to creatures that had never heard a gentle word in their entire lives. Not all the attempts succeeded. Many Varkin were too deeply conditioned, too broken by generations of violent breeding to remember what they had once been. People died trying to reach creatures that could not be reached, but enough succeeded that the Kovathi began to notice reports, flooded into the central command. Varkin refusing orders. Varkin protecting slaves instead of attacking them. Varkin abandoning their posts to follow the beings who had shown them kindness. Commander Jalver, still in orbit above Vela 7, received these reports with growing horror. This is impossible, he insisted at a meeting with his officers. The Varkin are our creations. We control them absolutely. How can a handful of slaves undo 10,000 years of breeding? Scholar Tethani, who had become something of an unwilling expert on the situation, offered the only explanation she had. They are not undoing the breeding, Commander. They are simply offering something that the breeding could not completely eliminate: connection, companionship, care. The Varkin were once social creatures before we turned them into weapons. That instinct was buried but not destroyed, and these acts of kindness are bringing it back to the surface. Then we must destroy any Varkin that shows this weakness. We have tried, another officer reported grimly, but when we attempt to put down affected Varkin, the others react violently. It is as if the kindness is spreading between them somehow. Like an infection of the mind, Jalver slammed his fist against the table. Then we will destroy them all. We will purge every Varkin in the Empire and start the breeding program over from the beginning. The room fell silent at this declaration. The Varkin represented 3,000 years of military investment, the cornerstone of Korathi power across the galaxy. Commander, Tethani said quietly, if we destroy the Varkin, we lose our greatest weapon. The conquered species will realize that we can be opposed, that our power is not absolute, and if we do not destroy them, they will be turned against us by slaves and farmers and children. Jalver shouted back. He turned to the view screen, which still showed the surveillance feed from the eastern greenhouse. Myra Okonkwo was teaching Ketharak to fetch objects and bring them back to her. And the ancient killer was participating in the game with something that looked disturbingly like joy. These humans, Jalver said, his voice cold with hatred, they have not just taken one weapon from us. They have shown the galaxy how to take them all. They have turned our strength into our weakness with nothing but patience and kindness. He turned back to his officers. I want every human on that planet dead by morning. We will burn this colony to the ground and make an example that the galaxy will never forget. But even as he gave the order, Jalver knew in his heart that it was already too late. The humans had planted a seed, and that seed was growing in the minds of every enslaved being across the Empire. The age of Korvathi dominance was coming to an end, not through violence or war, but through something far more dangerous: compassion. The morning of the final assault came with blood-red light from the twin suns. Commander Jalver descended to the surface personally, something he had not done in over 50 years of conquest. He brought 50 of his best soldiers, clad in the heaviest armor the Kovathi possessed, carrying weapons designed to kill starships. He would not fail again. He would not allow this small human colony to become the symbol that destroyed everything his empire had built. The survivors of Vela 7 had gathered near the eastern greenhouse during the night, drawn by some instinct or perhaps by hope. There were perhaps 2,000 of them left, men and women and children who had lost their homes, their loved ones. Their sense of safety in the universe. Among them stood Adaze Okonkwo, who had found her way back to her daughter after 3 days of searching through the ruins. She had wept when she saw Myra alive, had held her so tightly that Myra thought her ribs might break, and had then stared in wonder at the massive creature that refused to leave her daughter's side, Now they all stood together. Humans and Varkin, facing the Korvati soldiers who had come to kill them. Zalvar stepped forward, his 4 eyes fixed on the small girl at the center of the human group. She was standing beside Ketharak, one hand resting on his scarred leg. And she did not look afraid. He hated her more than he had ever hated anything in his entire life. "You have caused great damage to the Korvathi Empire," he called out, his voice amplified to carry across the open ground. "You have corrupted our weapons, inspired rebellion among our slaves, and made us look weak in the eyes of the galaxy." Myra said nothing. She simply watched him with her steady dark eyes. "But it ends here," Zalvar continued. "This colony will be destroyed. Every human will be killed. And the galaxy will learn what happens to those who defy us." A man stepped forward from the human crowd, David Chun, the veterinarian who had bonded with Tethaver. The younger Varkin stood beside him, rumbling with quiet warning. "You do not have to do this," David said. "We are not your enemies. We never wanted to be your enemies. We just want to live in peace." Zalvar made a sound of contempt. "Peace is for the weak. The universe belongs to the strong, and the strong take what they want. Is that what you truly believe?" Myra asked, and her small voice somehow carried across the distance between them. "Do you really think strength only means hurting others?" The Korvathi commander stared at this human child who had single-handedly done more damage to his empire than any army or fleet. What else could it mean? He demanded. Myra looked up at Tetharak, at the ancient killer who had become her protector and friend. She thought about everything she had learned in the past week, about the power of kindness and the weakness of cruelty. "Strength means being able to choose," she said. "Strength means deciding what kind of creature you want to be. Your Varkin were strong enough to kill anything in the galaxy, but they were never allowed to choose anything. You made all their choices for them, and that made them weak in the only way that matters." She stepped forward, and Ketharak moved with her, his massive body positioned to shield her from the Korvathi weapons. "But now they can choose," Myra continued. "And they are choosing to be kind instead of cruel, to protect instead of destroy, to love instead of hate. That is real strength. The strength to be better than what someone else made." "You," Zalvar felt rage boiling in his chest. "Pretty words from a child. But words will not stop weapons fire." The Korvathi soldiers raised their guns, and Ketharak moved. He was old, scarred, and weary from 200 years of violence, but he was still the greatest killer the Corvée had ever bred. And now he was fighting for something he had never had before, a reason to fight. He hit the first line of soldiers like a thunderstorm, his claws moving with blinding speed. But he was not killing them. He was disarming them, breaking their weapons, knocking them aside with precisely measured force. Tethaver joined him. And then the third Varkin, the one who had bonded with a young human engineer named Sarah. They fought as a unit, protecting the humans behind them while using the minimum force necessary to neutralize the Korvathi attackers. The soldiers had been trained to fight enemies who wanted to kill them. They had no idea how to handle opponents who were clearly holding back, who could have killed them instantly, but chose not to. The battle lasted less than 5 minutes when it was over. The Korvathi soldiers were scattered across the ground, alive but defeated. Their weapons lay broken around them, and the 3 Varkins stood between them and the human survivors, like living. Lost Commander Zalvar found himself alone, his personal guard unconscious at his feet, his weapons destroyed, facing the girl and her beast with nothing but his rage. "This changes nothing," he snarled. "Even if you kill me, the Empire will send more ships, more soldiers, more Varkin. We will burn 100 human worlds for every one of ours that falls." "Maybe," Myra said softly, "but I do not think so." She pointed up at the sky, and Zalvar looked through the morning haze. He could see ships descending, not Korvathi warships, but vessels of designs he did not recognize. There were human ships, yes, but also Veldrani cruisers and Kolani transports and a dozen other species that have been conquered and enslaved for generations. The galaxy is watching, Myra said. They saw what happened here. They saw that your weapons can be turned, that your empire can be resisted, that kindness is stronger than cruelty. And now they are coming to help. Gelver stared at the sky as more and more ships appeared. A fleet assembled not through military alliance, but through shared hope, the hope that had been born in a ruined greenhouse when a small girl refused to run from a monster. This is impossible. He whispered no. Mira said, this is humanity. She walked forward until she was standing directly in front of the Korvathi commander. She was so small, barely reaching his chest, and he could have killed her with one swipe of his clawed hand. But he did not, because Catharak was watching, and so was the galaxy. And Commander Gelver finally understood that his time of absolute power was over. He could have ruled through partnership instead of conquest, Myra said. And there was no anger in her voice, only sadness. You could have built something beautiful with all the species of the galaxy. Something stronger than any empire built on fear. But you chose cruelty. And cruelty always falls in the end. She turned away from him and walked back to her mother, who was crying with relief and pride, and a dozen other emotions she could not name. Catharak followed her, and the other Varkin fell in behind him. They have made their choice, and they would never go back to what they had been. Above them, the first human relief ships began to land, bringing supplies and hope to a colony that had survived the unsurvivable. Korvathi Empire would not fall immediately. It would take years of patient work, countless acts of courage and kindness, a million small choices to be gentle instead of cruel, but it would fall in the history books that would be written centuries later. Scholars would trace the beginning of that fall to a single moment, a small girl in a ruined greenhouse, offering her hand to a monster and teaching him that he could be something more. That was the day the galaxy learned what humanity really was: not conquerors, not warriors, not masters of technology or strategy, but something far more dangerous to empires built on cruelty beings, who looked at monsters and saw creatures worthy of love, and that made all the difference.